Okay, hello everybody. Hello Grant.
Hello.
Thank you for being with us today. So, just to introduce you, I have a French audience that doesn't know a lot about you, about the vitamin A. So, I think in the in France, nobody is talking about the vitamin A toxicity. So, for me,
Right.
it's a great honor for me to have you today. So, just so that the people understand, I discovered your work and your two ebooks about the vitamin A toxicity after I discovered the videos of Garrett Smith.
Hmm.
And today I want to ask you a few questions about the vitamin A and all the research you've done.
Sure. Yeah, great. Let's get into it. Yeah.
Perfect. Um, so we can start with the first question. So um, back in the days, you had health problems. Maybe you can mention what kind of problem you had. And I want to know what was your situation when you first thought about vitamin A being potentially a cause of your health problem. So everything started.
Yeah, sure. I'll give you it's a bit of a long story, but I'll give you the long story as fast as I can. So back in 2006, I was diagnosed with chronic kidney disease. And it was progressively getting worse. And I was given a terminal prognosis of maybe having 5 or 6 years left. And so I didn't try to do anything to treat or deal with the chronic kidney disease. I was told there was really nothing they could do for me. It was just going to progressively get worse. And then by 2013, kind of right on time as far as my nephrologist had predicted, my health had gotten extremely bad. And I had at that time developed adult kind of body-wide eczema. When I say body-wide, I have to clarify that it wasn't, over my entire body all at the same time, but very big regions of my body, like my upper torso was covered with eczema. And it was very painful. And it was, people have experienced that condition. It's a very nasty condition. So of course, back to my doctor, we call it a GP here in Canada, general practitioner. Went back, multiple visits, going through the process of trying different, steroid creams and different pills and options. And then finally he basically told me there's nothing more we can do for you. You just have to go home and deal with this as best you can. But he told me it was going to progressively get worse and I'd probably have it for the rest of my life. uh, he mentioned that this was an autoimmune disease, which at the time I really didn't even know what the term autoimmune disease meant. So anyway, when I came home from that meeting with my doctor, since he had told me there was nothing he could do for me, and I was just going to be dealing with it for the rest of my life, I thought, I went looking, is there something I could do to kind of relieve some of the symptoms of it? In no way was I ever thinking I was going to reverse it or cure it. And at that time, I had made no connection at all. Didn't even think there was a connection between the eczema and the chronic kidney disease. Now, as far as I was thinking, and these are completely two different organ systems and probably unrelated. Um, so what I did when I came home from my doctor's visit, that last doctor's visit, I got on the internet and started looking at, what other people are doing, for eczema and just general kind of, a background research. I mean, research is a strong word. Background understanding what is eczema, what am I dealing with, and what's kind of the basic science of it. So I went to some of the big national foundation sites for eczema, and also for some particular reason for Crohn's and colitis. I was also suffering from serious GI issues at the same time, like very serious. And what I came across was documented on those sites, and a lot of sites that talk about autoimmune disease. There's this thing that happens with an autoimmune disease called a flare-up. And so, if your audience is not familiar with that, it's when you have, like, let's just take eczema for example. You have kind of a background level of the eczema rash with a kind of background level of severity, but over time it cycles and goes into these periods of extreme severity, called a flare-up. And so I had experienced multiple flare-ups of my autoimmune disease, so I knew very well what that was all about. Then on these websites, they're talking about these flare-ups, and they're talking about trigger foods. And there's a list of trigger foods, and these sites were advising that these trigger foods or food did not cause your disease, but these trigger foods can cause it to go up into this flare-up, which is this extreme level of severity. And so there's, multiple sites are saying, you have to discover what your trigger foods are and avoid them. And I thought, well, that's very strange. Started reading the list of the trigger foods, or common trigger foods, and milk and dairy is one of the common trigger foods. Now, here in Canada, milk is fortified with vitamin A. So there's a certain, natural vitamin A content in dairy milk, but it's also supplemented with something called vitamin A palmitate, which is, anyway, that's kind of a detail. And I had previously, kind of going back to kind of around 2006, I had a lot of severe gum recession in my teeth. My dentist was alerting to me to, at relatively young age, 55 years old or so, I had this severe gum recession. And he advised me, you should eat more calcium. You should get more calcium in your diet. So I was really drinking a lot of milk. So I thought, okay, milk was going to be the antidote, and I was going to help my gum recession by drinking milk. What I didn't know was I was also at the same time zooming my consumption of vitamin A, particularly vitamin A palmitate. But anyway, back to reading about these trigger foods. Milk was one of the very commonly cited trigger foods for an autoimmune disease flare-up. And I thought, what the heck is in milk? Like, well, this sounds so strange to me. And, literally went to my refrigerator, pulled out the milk jug, read the label, and it said, vitamin A and vitamin D added. And so I started to look at the possibility that I had just over consumed on vitamin A. I looked at vitamin D for kind of like 30 minutes, and I kind of ruled it out because the symptoms of vitamin D toxicity did not really match the symptoms that I was experiencing. But then I went to look at the symptoms of vitamin A toxicity. And at that time, I knew absolutely nothing about vitamin A. I had no knowledge of vitamins, or, I had no background in health and really no interest in health, just going through my life like a regular guy. So I went and looked at the published symptoms of vitamin A toxicity, and there's a lot of them. There's a big, long list, but I had checked off many of the boxes. So my own personal symptoms were a very close match for vitamin A toxicity. And then I did what I thought would be, the most sensible, the most reasonable thing that, anybody should have done, 20 years ago, is I went through the list of the published trigger foods. It's dairy, some fish, tomatoes, and some other foods. And I went out to the U.S. Department of Agriculture website, and they have a nice database of the molecular compositions of most foods. And so I put them into a database, a relational database. I said, okay, here's all the molecular composition of these trigger foods. And it did, what's called a SQL query, and joined these lists to find out what's common about these trigger foods. And lo and behold, it was vitamin A. That was the common factor across these trigger foods. And I thought, well, this is too easy. This is just, I must be missing something. This is just way too simple. But just kind of on a had nothing else to do as far as trying to attempt to treat my condition. And I thought it was just absolutely foolish for me to even think this way. But I thought, well, I'll just give it a try. I'll just eliminate all the vitamin A from my diet for a while and just see if there's any response. And so it took about 3 weeks, and then I was very, very close to giving up, because in those first 3 weeks, I'd experienced no improvement in my health or my symptoms at all. It was just basically steady state misery. But then kind of on day 21 or 22, I had a huge improvement in my joint health, like overnight, literally overnight. Went from, like almost a decade of this kind of background, medium level severity of joint pain, primarily in my knees. And then on that, 21st or 22nd day, that joint pain went away, like completely. And it was like so dramatic that it was just, it was very dramatic. So on a hunch, I thought, maybe I am onto something here. And so that's how I got started on investigating vitamin A. And, from there, I went much deeper in researching, the history of vitamin A, its functional mechanism, and just as deep as I could possibly go on understanding, the published literature on vitamin A. So I've really spent a good part of the last, 10 years, my free time, I guess, in the last 10 years, investigating this topic and promoting this theory that a lot of the chronic diseases are actually caused by chronic vitamin A toxicity. So that's the history.
Okay, thanks. So about your let's stay on your personal experience for the moment.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience? Because as far as I know, you're now avoiding vitamin A for more than 10 years, if I'm correct.
Yeah, that's
Is
correct.
your health still improving? Do you measure your blood vitamin E content? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so on my website, I've got a blog where I publish kind of an annual update of my health. And yes, I would say my health is continuing to improve. So the biggest dramatic improvement in my health was in the first kind of 3 years. And then every year subsequent to that, I've seen small improvements in my health. And I have had regressions where I've had periods of time where my health has regressed and gotten poorer for a while, but progressively overall, it's getting better and better, which is quite remarkable because I'm getting older and older with every year. So it should not be getting better and better, but it is. Recently I went through a period of a lot of personal stress in my life, and my health took a decline, but that was only for about the last 2 or 3 weeks, kind of like a severe, let's say severe flu or cold, but I'm absolutely sure that was caused by stress. Um, uh, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question completely, Jeremy. Is there another part
Yeah,
of
it's
it?
it's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you publish on your website your blood work about vitamin A? Do you monitor these kind of things?
Well, I do a little bit. It's very hard to get a vitamin A test here in Canada. So we have a nationalized healthcare system in Canada. It's not like the United States where I can just go to a doctor and pay for a test. You have to get a requisition from your doctor, and they won't do that in Canada on a discretionary basis. So and I haven't found a good source online to get a vitamin A test. So yes, I do kind of game the system, and I do get a vitamin A test, every now and then. So I do publish that on my website. Yeah.
Okay, so can you tell us about the amount? Are you on the regular range, or are you
Oh no.
so no?
So yeah, no. 4 years ago, I think 4 or 5 years ago, I published a blog post. So I'm down at 0.1 millimole per meter, and the general range for an adult my age is something like 2.2. So I'm 20 times lower. Back then, it was 20 times lower. And then I had a recent test, I think about a year ago, and it went up a little bit, but that's explainable. So yeah, right now for the last 8 years, I've clinically been in a state of severe vitamin A deficiency as per kind of the guidelines. And when I do get the test, they give me a big warning in red saying you're in a state of severe vitamin A deficiency, supplementation is recommended, kind of thing. So yeah, that's what I do. Yeah.
Okay. Um, okay. Before we move to the aspect of the real toxicity of the vitamin A,
Right.
just maybe a naive question. How do you know
Mhm.
that your recovering was caused only by avoiding vitamin A and not other factors?
Well, there could be some other factors, but overall, all of my symptoms, like I documented in my ebooks and what I just described, were perfect match for vitamin A toxicity. And by adopting this diet of removing, as much as humanly possible, any vitamin A from my diet, all of those symptoms have gone away. And so um, they're not the symptoms of, a toxicity of something else, with maybe one exception. Um, and so it's just the fact that these list of symptoms and recovery of all those symptoms align so perfectly that tells me yes, it's vitamin A. And as a matter of fact, there's been a case where kind of, I forget if it was like 6 months or so into my diet experiment, I inadvertently added some more vitamin A back into my diet, just foolishly. I was, just some, maybe I should be more specific. So in the medical literature, there's this claim that, both vitamin A are needed for eye health and vision, but it's also another claim that something called lutein and zeaxanthin are, essential for eye health too. And so when I first started this, I thought, okay, I'll keep eliminating that vitamin A, but I'll add the lutein and zeaxanthin. But I didn't realize that those are also vitamin A molecules. But when I added those back, I had a huge regression in my health and another huge flare up, autoimmune disease flare up. So there was another good indication that um, this was causal. So, I've actually investigated kind of the medical established kind of guidelines for determining causation. And one of the things that you have to do is prove that, by adding something, it promotes the symptoms. And then if you remove it, those symptoms are removed. So that's kind of one of the de facto premises or requirements for proving causation. So I've done both of that. I've removed vitamin A. I've recovered, my disease conditions or my symptoms of the disease conditions, and then inadvertently I added it back and had a big flare up in those disease conditions. So it's another good validation point that yes, vitamin A caused my poor health.
Okay, thanks. So now we can move to the more technical aspect if you want.
Mm-hmm.
Fundamentally, what makes vitamin A so toxic? Just briefly.
Unfortunately, it's not a really brief answer for that. So there's lots of claims in the medical literature about vitamin A and vitamin A activity. Um, one of the primary claims is it regulates stem cell differentiation. The other big claim of vitamin A is it regulates protein synthesis. And what you have to understand is that all cells in the body are constantly producing proteins for their biological function. So lots of different proteins are produced by a cell. So it's claimed that vitamin A regulates this protein synthesis. And there's about 500 different proteins that are claimed to be regulated by vitamin A. And so what that means is when you expose cells to vitamin A, they start producing these variations in proteins. And the medical science or literature claims that that's a function of vitamin A, like a positive function of vitamin A regulating protein. Well, I now know that that's not correct. And what we're actually seeing is vitamin A actually inducing a toxin effect on the cell and altering the cell's ability to properly produce proteins. And so vitamin A bonds to DNA and RNA. So what happens, of course, when a cell is producing a protein, it uses the DNA to produce an RNA molecule. That RNA molecule is sent into the ribosome. The ribosome uses that molecular template to weave together a protein. But what happens with vitamin A? It gets jammed into and stuck to the DNA or the RNA. And then when the cell goes to assemble the protein, it's actually got this foreign molecule in the template or in the pattern. So it produces a defective protein. Now, in the case of autoimmune diseases, what that means is the cell starts producing foreign species appearing proteins. So the immune system detects these defective proteins and assumes that they're not even assumes, correctly determines that these are not proper, probably, or maybe came from a foreign source, let's say from a bacteria, or whatever, is just wrong. And so the immune system then attacks that cell because the cell is defectively producing these foreign proteins or appearing to be foreign proteins. So vitamin A, the reason it's so toxic, it causes the defective synthesis of proteins. And in the medical literature, it's really kind of documented that the most profound effect of vitamin A is on stem cells, which I think is correct. But it's hard to kind of determine this for the average person, but the stem cells are the very base layer in an epithelial or endothelial tissue. And that tissue structure is used throughout the body. It's not just your skin and eyes, and it's used throughout your digestive tract and your glands and every tube. And most structures in the body have this basal membrane with these stem cells. And so vitamin A is actually damaging those stem cells and causing them to be malformed. And so the tissue becomes malformed. And as cells are producing these defective proteins, they can't do their proper job. The immune system detects this, comes in and attacks those cells, and you get this massive amount of inflammation. So that's the long story about how vitamin A damages tissue and destroys our health.
Okay, thanks. Um, for example, in your book, you talk about different medical fields. For example, you talk about vitamin A in dermatology. You talk about autoimmunity. So in
Yeah.
each field, you present evidence. You explain how the vitamin A is toxic. So for me, that have read your two books, and I read it every day because I don't understand everything. But for a
Mhm.
person who doesn't know about your books, how could we synthesize synthesize this this idea that this is toxic in every field? Because nobody is going to, all my audience, I know that for sure that not everybody is going to read the
Oh
books.
yeah, yeah. So and unfortunately, it's a big topic with a a long history, and it is there's a lot to kind of understand there. So unfortunately, there's not a really quick summary. I guess I should
Yes.
probably attempt to put that together, but kind of maybe let's back up. And so, what is vitamin A? So vitamin A, all vitamin A originates in plants. And plants use vitamin A to absorb sunlight. So there is, I'm going to call it a it's not really correct terminology. I'll call it a cyclohexane group on the vitamin A molecule with an isoprene side chain. So anyway, so plants use that to absorb sunlight. And then, of course, we have animals that are eating plants, and we eat plants, and some we eat the animals that eat the plants. And so, vitamin A is pervasive. It's throughout all of our food, and you cannot, reasonably, avoid all vitamin A. So, my concern is not so much about, well, let me say, and the human body is super well adapted to deal with vitamin A on a reasonable basis. So if you're not doing something foolish like eating liver or sweet potatoes or spinach or kale or these what I call the big ticket vitamin A items, and this is not a huge concern unless you're in really poor health and you think your health is caused by vitamin A, then there's a huge time factor here. So I just want to kind of set the stage that I'm not trying to raise the alarm that you need to avoid all vitamin A. Even though it is toxic, that's okay because we can deal with a certain amount of that quite well. So just trying to remember the second part of your question, or your question was, kind of, a quick summary. So yeah, so vitamin A is pervasive. It damages tissue throughout the body. And so this is why it affects so many disease categories. For sure, in my opinion, most of the autoimmune diseases are being caused by vitamin A toxicity, or what's called chronic vitamin A toxicity, and a lot of other diseases also. So maybe I should talk about acute vitamin A toxicity versus chronic vitamin A toxicity. Is that a good
Yes.
point to talk about this,
I,
Jeremy?
I
Okay.
think I think it's a good point because in the medical science, it's established that vitamin E is toxic. We know that when we go on liver
Yeah.
tox. So, I mean, the discussion is on the what is the dose? What is the toxic dose that you can handle?
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. It's not just the dose. It
Ah,
depends on cumulative
yes.
exposure.
Okay.
So what happens with vitamin A? It bioaccumulates. So you're a young teenager or a young person, you can tolerate a lot more vitamin A than you could. So let's say when you get to my age in your 50s and 60s, because you've had decades of bioaccumulation and your liver is bioaccumulating that. And as the liver becomes more and more saturated, you're less able to deal with a dose. So the dose that a person can deal with at a young age is pretty high, let's say a daily dose. But as you get older, it gets smaller and smaller. So in the medical literature, you're right, it's completely acknowledged and established that vitamin A can be toxic. The other claim is that it's a vitamin, and you only have to be concerned if you're getting too much of it, and if you get too little of it, there's another concern. But let's talk about in the medical literature what's described as acute vitamin A toxicity, and then we'll talk about chronic vitamin A toxicity. So acute vitamin A toxicity is when someone's taken such a large dose of vitamin A, which might not be too large, but let's say a large dose. Let's say, you've eaten, liver, whatever for, 6 months or something, and you start to get signs of vitamin A toxicity, and that would be called acute vitamin A toxicity. So you've taken such a large dose over a short enough period of time that, almost or very quickly you start to see the symptoms of vitamin A toxicity. So that's one scenario. And that does happen. It does happen kind of reasonably often. And usually when people, recognize that and they get off the high dose vitamin A, they make a pretty good recovery. Then there's another scenario that's in the medical literature of chronic vitamin A toxicity. And that's what I was referring to before, where over time you have this bioaccumulation of vitamin A, saturates your liver, saturates, your adipose tissue, and really kind of breaks down your body's defensive measures against that toxicity. And then after that, even small doses of vitamin A on a daily basis can be a problem because now your body's not able to deal with it. So that's the chronic vitamin A toxicity scenario. And so really the focus of my books and my concern and my, what I'm doing is all about chronic vitamin A toxicity. I'm not really, that concerned about acute vitamin A toxicity because that's simpler and easier to deal with. And even though chronic vitamin A toxicity is hugely acknowledged in the medical literature, it's really downplayed. And no one's really, doing what I'm doing or in the medical research field and really kind of raising the concern that, hold on, there's something very important here. So that's that. Anyway, that's a summary.
Okay, thanks. So the discussion is more on the cumulative dose of the
Yes.
vitamin A through the
Yeah.
life. And my
Great.
question is, today, with all do you think vitamin A has a physiological role on the body, or it is a pure toxin?
I think it's my opinion is a pure toxin. So yeah, there's this dichotomy and this very bizarre um, dual claim about vitamin A. One, it's an essential vitamin, and completely acknowledged also at the same time that it's very toxic if you get too much of it. And so my premise and my position is that the determination of vitamin A being a vitamin with a positive biological role is completely flawed. It's not valid and it's simply not true. And so, that's the whole purpose of what I'm doing, my blog and what I'm doing personally with my own health. And also, many other people now are on a ultra low vitamin A diet that are also proving that there's no health consequences of not having vitamin A. So, yeah.
Okay, so your proof is through the experience.
My proof is through the experience. In my second ebook, I had documented the early animal study that had determined that vitamin A was a vitamin. And I go through a lot of evidence, refuting that study and proving why that study is flawed. I've actually added more evidence to that in one of my blog posts. And then, the whole intent and purpose of my books was to make this message compelling enough and kind of scientifically based enough where people would take this on and participate in this project. And I don't want to call it an experiment, but so, not only have I done this now 10 years, there's other people 5 and 6 years, and there's now, literally, hundreds and hundreds of people that are using a low vitamin A diet, and nobody has seen a health consequence would line up with the claim that it's an essential vitamin. So some of the primary claims about vitamin A being a vitamin is that it's, quote, essential for vision. I can guarantee you, I can actually see you pretty well right now. It's also claimed to be essential for the regulation of stem cell differentiating cells. And people, you kind of need to, there's a backstory there and what that really means. That means it's the way your body maintains a tissue is through stem cells and the proliferation of those stem cells and kind of how a stem cell kind of grows up from being this variable kind of cell that can turn into real tissue structures. And that's claimed to be regulated by vitamin A. But if that was true, after 10 years of no vitamin A in my diet, I should not be here. My skin should have disintegrated. All my organs and glands and tissue should have just disintegrated and fell apart. The other claim that vitamin A is essential for life itself, and that you will die in 3 to 4 years without vitamin A and you died. Well, here I am 10 years and I'm still doing pretty well, actually, better than I've ever done in the last decade. So the claim that it's an essential vitamin is wrong. And there's one of these, I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit of a rant. I can stop, but there's something important that people need to understand. In science, you don't need to have a big study to prove or disprove a claim in science, a hypothesis in science. You only need one case. And so, that is the fundamental rule in science, and which the medical establishment, does not follow the real rules of science. They always rely on these studies with lots of subjects and statistical analysis, but that is not valid science. So if somebody puts together a hypothesis or a claim of a certain, theory, and you have one case, just one case that doesn't line up with that theory, then the theory is wrong. That's just the fundamental rule of science. So not only, have I proven it now with 10 years, but there's, like I said, there's now hundreds of people doing this, and not a single person is reported going blind. So that's the other essential claim of vitamin A. It's required for vision. You will go blind without vitamin A. Vitamin A is part of the vision cycle. Hold on, it's just not lining up with reality. So that would be my evidence of why it's not a vitamin, and we know for sure that it's toxic at a high dose. Well, it's actually toxic at a low dose, and that fact is actually published in the medical literature too. So multiple cases in studies and reports that I've read that vitamin A is actually too toxic to be in serum outside of what's called the retinol binding protein. And so there's no question that vitamin A is a toxin. We're now proving that it's not a vitamin, so therefore that leaves the fact that it is only a toxin.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I want to just add something. In your book, you propose to the people to make an experiment. Well, you don't propose,
Yeah.
but you suggest that the people can take at home gerbils
Right, right.
and feed them with no vitamin A to see. Do you have people who did that and wrote you?
Unfortunately, there's only been one other person that I know of that has done that, and his animals lasted, I'm going to say, I think it was 51 weeks, almost a year, and now kind of, I don't remember if it was actually 2, but he did it. He did that experiment on mice. There's somebody else currently conducting that experiment,
Okay.
but I'm very disappointed that more people haven't done that. But it is what it is. But so that the small animal study is interesting, but no, kind of in parallel, kind of jumping way ahead of that is we now have people, participating in this. So we've got, let's say, very large human study going on right now being conducted.
Yes, because that
Yeah.
was one of the argument I remember. So you told in your second book, I think that every farmer can tell you that rats can live
Oh yeah.
with grains several
Oh yeah.
months and they have no vitamin A. Can you maybe elaborate this?
Yeah, oh, sure. Well, I, I grew up in Saskatchewan, which is the province over from us, and I grew up on a farm, a small farm. And I remember one winter, my father had pulled over this portable grain container. We call it a little granary, pretty big, and it was leaking grain. And there's a big nest of rats living underneath this grain. It was in the middle of the winter, kind of 9 months into winter, and here's this pile of rats living off nothing but grain, and they were doing great, until my dad handed me the 22 rifle, and I started to eliminate them. But yeah, so yeah, that's a very key point actually, because the claim in the literature, particular the original study that determined vitamin A was an essential vitamin, the Wolbach Canal study from 1925-26, their animals started to die in it was like 8 or 12 weeks, like very severe disease in dying, in eight to 12 weeks. But animals in nature go for months and months and months, without any vitamin A, and they're dying. Especially, some of the herbivores. They're like here in the prairies. We've got deer and antelope, and these animals do not massively die off in the winter. Now, winters are very harsh, but still these animals survive. So it's just, in my mind, it's ludicrous for someone to think that an animal is going to die from a deficiency in 8 to 12 weeks. It's just not sensible. It's never happened in nature. It hasn't happened in the last 500 years, and it's not going to happen in the next 500 years. So, that's just such a huge glaring point that original study was just so flawed. It's ridiculous, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Um, do you think vitamin A toxicity is an issue today because we are overloaded with other toxins and it was not the case before? Or
Yes, yeah, I do. So I guess my premise is, let's go back to like turn of the centuries. Let's say, in the early 1900s, people were eating a reasonable, let's say in North America, probably Northern Europe, people were eating a reasonable amount of vitamin A. Our food was also seasonal, so we didn't have, these brightly colored fruits and vegetables, 365 days a year. We can go to the supermarket and buy whatever we want. That was not the case back in the early, 1900s, 1800s. It was very seasonal. People would have been living far more off of, simple grains like wheat and barley and stuff like that. So vitamin A toxicity is now more of a concern because we just have this huge abundance of access to, let's say, medium to high vitamin A content foods, and we're consuming a lot more of it. So it's just more of it bioaccumulating. But to make matters much worse, in the 1970s, mid 1970s, vitamin A was supplemented with a lot of the food supply throughout the world, most certainly in North America and around the world. And there's also vitamin A supplementations programs going on in about 110 countries, funded by and organized by the World Health Organization. So there's just been a lot more exposure to vitamin A. But you bring up another good point. It's not just vitamin A. So I'm raising the concern about vitamin A toxicity, but there's lots of other toxins in our environment that we never had before. And so all of these, they bioaccumulate and they compound. So, these other toxins, let's say like glyphosate, they're compounding the toxin burden on the liver and other tissues, and then you got vitamin A. So yeah, it's more of everything, but it's also more of vitamin A also being much higher in our food environment than it ever was before. And so, like I said before, humans are well adapted to deal with vitamin A on a reasonable basis. What we're consuming today is no longer reasonable. It's an order of magnitude more than we would have ever kind of on average naturally consumed before. So that's my premise.
okay, if I'm asking you this question, is because as a naturopath, I see the trend today in the health world in France, and a lot of people are coming back to like they call it, ancestral diet,
Right.
uh, a large influence by the Weston Price spirit, the animal based, and it's growing like the years the
Okay.
coming years, and people are consuming a lot of eggs, a lot of raw dairy, a lot of liver, cod liver oil, and the claim is that for example, the book that everybody's talking about is the Weston Price book, and
Okay. Let's talk
we
about
can
that. Yeah.
we can talk about that, and we are
Yeah.
told in this book that the vitamin A content of the food eaten in the ancestral population contain a lot more vitamin A than the regular foods that were found in the US. So what do you think
Mhm.
about this subject?
Well, I think first off, I think Weston A. Price was a complete fraud. I'm absolutely convinced of that. I think the guy was um, he's right up there with somebody like Ansel Keys, who was cooking the books, cooking the data, and not not being honest. I worked in the Canadian Arctic. So one of the claims of Western A. Price is that the Inuit in the Canadian Arctic were, fantastic health, great health, and blah blah blah. Well, that's a complete lie. That is just an absolute lie. I worked in the Canadian Arctic in the 1980s. And when I was up there, at that time, I wasn't interested in health, but I was very observant. I was a very observant young person. And I would see young people there, kind of my age, in way worse health, and especially their dental health. These young people would have horrible dental health, like shockingly. and also, just overall health of the community was very not good. And then maybe, part of my research on vitamin A, but even coincidentally before that, I looked at some of the health data. So Canada, a while back, several decades back, had a very good program where the Canadian government, through an organization called Stats Canada, they had a division of that did what they called the National Health Check or Health Data Collection. And they're collecting health data from across Canada, I think on a yearly basis, and doing a very good job of that. So probably, for whatever, just by coincidence, I was looking at this data, but even back into the 1950s and 60s, but that region of Canada is, by Health Canada stats, not just by my own personal observation by being there and working there, but the Health Canada data for that region shows that the Inuit have some of the poorest health in the entire country. They have the highest rate of cancer, one of the highest rates of cancer, a high rate of mental health diseases, early death. So Weston Price was an absolute fraud, and I've recently put up a blog post on eating liver and cancer, and maybe if you can share that with your viewers, and they can read that. And I actually mentioned this thing on Weston Price, and somebody commented on that blog post below that there's several members of the vitamin A or the Weston Price community that have been dying early at a young age from cancer. I think one person died from brain cancer. So the advice for eating liver and cod liver oil is absolutely insane, and nobody should do it. And just be very, very careful of any advice you're getting from somebody, because the level of vitamin A in cod liver oil and liver is by definition. So the guidelines for vitamin A are kind of on the consumption. Let's go to the National Institute of Health, or one of the government databases on what is the recommended daily dosage for vitamin A. So there's two amounts that are listed there. One is called the RDA, so this is the recommended daily amount. And there's another one called the upper tolerable limit. And so in the United States, the RDA is around, let's say, 3,000 international units, and the upper daily amount is 10,000. But, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 ounces of liver are going to put you at, 15 or 20,000. It's way over the upper limit. So by definition, by government standards, eating liver is absolutely vitamin A toxic, and cod liver oil would be too. And so, you don't have to take my word for it, but you just do the math, and you just go out to the National Institute of Health site, look at their guidelines for vitamin A consumption. You'll see this is way beyond their guidelines for the upper tolerable limit. And anyway, I'm going to stop. I'm going on a bit of a rant. So no, Weston Price, complete fraud.
Okay, thanks. We can say on the food, for example, we can get asked that we can see that in the breast milk or in the eggs there is vitamin E. If it's a toxin, how it's possible to find it so much in this product? What is your opinion?
Sure. Yeah, well, so vitamin A is a fat soluble molecule. So it naturally gets emulsified and carried in fat molecules. And so breast milk and eggs, they have, the eggs have the cholesterol, which is a form of fat. Breast milk has fat. And so it's going to naturally show up in breast milk. But that doesn't mean that it's a good thing. If you go to, maybe for your audience, they could just, search up biotoxins found in human breast milk, even human breast milk. And so in human breast milk, there's biotoxins such as dioxin, benzene, jet fuel, and a whole bunch of other very serious biotoxins are now found in human breast milk, most certainly throughout North America, and probably in Europe also. So just the fact that something is showing up in breast milk by no means means that it's safe. The reason it's there is just because of the fact that it's fat soluble. So it's, there's vitamin A and other toxins in animal fat, and there's vitamin A and other toxins in human fat. So it's it's a fallacy to believe just because it's in something really that should be really great, like breast milk, that it should be there or it's safe.
Okay, thank you. Um, Now I would like to talk about a point you mentioned in your, I think it's the first book. Uh, it was a graph about the evolution of, I think it was Alzheimer disease in
Right,
Canada
right.
when the cod liver oil fishing was
Stopped.
prohibited,
Yeah,
but was stopped.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
I think this is this was a study that kept in my mind. And can you elaborate on that study, please?
Sure. So maybe some background. So the east coast of Canada was probably, I think it was the biggest cod fishery in the world for a good long time, for like hundreds of years. And coincidentally, the east coast of Canada uh, has the highest, one of the highest disease rates in not only in Canada, but for Alzheimer's, dementia, and Crohn's and colitis, the highest rates in the world. So like on, I'm going to say 1.5 or 2x higher than anywhere else in the world. And this is an anomaly. And it's kind of interesting because back in my university days, once again, I had no interest in health. Was a Canadian living in Western Canada. It was well known generally in the public that Eastern Canada had a higher rate of disease, higher rate of cancer, higher rate of Alzheimer's dementia, higher rate of Crohn's and colitis. And it was just generally known that, for whatever reason, people out there are more susceptible to disease. Then what happened in, I think it was 1991 or 1993, the Canadian government, the cod fishery had been fished almost to extinction. And the Canadian government, for one of the few times did exactly the right thing, and they abruptly closed the cod fisheries. Just like overnight, they announced that there'd be no more cod fishing, and we're just going to stop cod fishing and let the stock, um, you know, regenerate itself. Hopefully recover from this almost near extinction event. And then I think it was, I don't remember the dates on that study, but there was a study done at the university, one of the universities in Nova Scotia, I think the University of Halifax, and they had documented that for some completely unknown reason, the rate of Alzheimer's dementia in the region had dropped something like 40%, and the rate of Crohn's and colitis had dropped, I think, like 50%. And that drop in those two diseases had never been reported anywhere else in the world, and most certainly not to that extent. And so once again, we have, I would say, proof of causation, because that region had a much higher consumption of cod liver oil or cod oil, and much higher rate of disease. And then when that source was removed from the region, we had a significant drop in the rate of those two diseases. So I think that is a really important finding. And I actually sent an email to those researchers that had published that study, and they said, well, this is really interesting, we'll get back to you. But of course, I never heard back from them. There's no follow-up. Yeah, so that was one of the key points of my two ebooks. So thank you for mentioning that. I was very interested in that.
Yes. Okay.
And maybe I'll just mention, kind of going on, I just mentioned it fits perfectly with my understanding of what vitamin A does to protein synthesis. So vitamin A is damaging protein synthesis throughout the body. Not, now your brain also has stem cells, and your brain is also being maintained. And one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's dementia are these amyloid plaques. These amyloid plaques are defectively structured proteins. And so it fits perfectly, because if tissue is being properly maintained with proper proteins, you're going to have a proper structure. But if it's not being maintained properly with proper proteins, you're going to have these weird proteins showing up that are malformed, which is the amyloid plaques. And then also you have these holes developing in people's brains with Alzheimer's dementia. And that's because the cells aren't able to maintain themselves. So the maintenance of the tissue is just disintegrating. So it's a very good match for, functionally, for what's happening with Alzheimer's and dementia.
okay. Do you know somebody else in the world who is talking about the toxicity of vitamin A like you?
Well, there are a few people. It's interesting. Vitamin A is, uh, it's a huge money maker, both in the supplement space and kind of other spaces for the pharmaceutical industry. It's actually used as a chemotherapy drug. So this is a big money maker. And you really can't talk badly about vitamin A, or things won't go well for your career, let's say. But there have been a few people. So there was a researcher in the, I think, 1960s, early 70s. His name was Pitt, and he published a paper saying that he felt that vitamin A was as toxic as cyanide. So that was one researcher. Then I mentioned this other citation in my ebook about, I think his name is Rothman. Forget his first name. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But he published a paper about the teratogenic toxicity of vitamin A, meaning vitamin A is causing, so super well documented in medical literature that vitamin A causes birth defects, and most certainly birth defects that are malformed bones, tissues, cleft lip, cranial birth defects. So very serious birth defects, completely known to be caused by an excess of vitamin A. And he raised the alarm that the guideline for vitamin A during pregnancy is too high. And you don't have to go very much over the RDA before you actually start seeing a higher incidence rate of birth defects. So, but he was kind of shot down. So when someone publishes a paper that's pointing out the risk of vitamin A, other people in the medical establishment, quickly try to shoot that down. There's another researcher, his name was Michael Latham, and he published a paper called The Vitamin A Fiasco. And he was really talking about, the poor health outcomes of children around the world that are being supplemented with vitamin A by the World Health Organization. And immediately, he was kind of shut down and challenged, I guess, if you want to say that. There's another researcher that has written a lot of papers about vitamin A toxicity, potential vitamin A toxicity, and that's Anthony Mawson. He has maybe, I'm going to say, 30 papers that discuss vitamin A toxicity to a very varying degrees and how it's implicated in a lot of diseases. He's not of the same opinion as me, where I'm saying, hold on, vitamin A is not a vitamin at all. I think Anthony is still believing that, okay, maybe there is some vitamin aspect to, or so let's say some vitamin aspect of vitamin A, some beneficial aspect of it, but no question, when you get too much of it, it's toxic. So he has about, let's say, I'm guessing maybe 20 or 30 papers on vitamin A toxicity. So those are some off the top of my head. And there's other ones. There's another really good paper. I can send you some links if people want to read, about the toxicity of vitamin A. I'll send those and you can share those with your audience.
Yes, it would be nice. You said before that do you think it's possible, like, to heal with just low vitamin diet? We don't have to go very low. We can just
Yes.
eliminate the most dangerous
Yes.
food.
Yes. Yes, I do. And actually, this is a concern. So if someone goes extremely low on vitamin A, like what I've done, very often people are hitting what we call this detox setback, and I've got a separate blog post on that. And so I think that's amplified when people go cold turkey and remove, as much vitamin A from their diet as they possibly can. I think that's a mistake. So I think it's wiser and safer to slowly reduce the amount of vitamin A you're consuming. So I think first step would stay away from the big ticket items. So like most certainly nobody should be eating liver, cod liver oil ever again in their lives. No sweet potatoes, no mangoes, no spinach. Things like milk, eggs, butter kind of would be in the okay range. Other than if you're older like me and you're really sick, then even the amount of vitamin A in those foods is probably too much. So it's going to depend on someone's age, their long-term bioaccumulation, and their health state. But I'd say generally, people do not need to do what I'm doing. I'm doing what I'm doing for a scientific reason. I'm trying to prove that vitamin A is not essential. I'm still alive, no vitamin A for 10 years, or virtually no vitamin A for 10 years. So that's a scientific proof point. I'm not doing that for health reasons.
Okay. Yes, I just want to add something, like if we do simple math, to go over 10 times the RDA of vitamin A per day, it's like 1000% of the RDA. And this
Hmm.
can easily be reached with cod liver oil or liver
Oh
beef.
yeah.
But if you want to go on 10,000% of zinc, vitamin B1, or magnesium, it's almost impossible with food.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
so it's a vitamin
Right.
that you can very easily reach the
Yes.
toxicity point. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, we can talk about your diet because I think it's a very, well, I know you don't recommend that to the people, but maybe
Right.
can you elaborate on what kind of diet you had these 10 previous years?
Yeah. So for the last 10 years, I've been on a diet of beef, and I use bison, which is quite popular here where I live. This is a North American bison, or what's called buffalo. It's not the same animal as a water buffalo. Some people mistake that for this. It's not a water buffalo, it's bison. And the reason I went with bison is ultra low in vitamin A. So there's a little bit of vitamin A in beef, but if you go to bison, it's even lower. But generally, so beef and rice, black beans. I've now added apples into my diet. So that's it. Those are the three foods that I've been consuming for 10 years.
Okay, on a previous video, on an interview, you told that you didn't need a lot of calorie to maintain your weight.
That's right. Yeah.
Can
So very surprising. And I wrote about that in my uh, I have a recent blog post called Obesity Causation Version 2. And anyway, and I think I wrote about it in that blog post and maybe another one. Well, what's happened to me when I first started my diet, I was very hungry all the time. I needed food, a lot of food, uh, like throughout the day. And then over time, I had lost quite a bit of weight, and I also reduced the amount of food that I was needing by about 50%. So the calories and the amount of food that I eat today is about 50% of what I was eating 10 years ago. And my whole need for food is, I would say, completely changed. 10 years ago, when I woke up in the morning, I was very hungry and very hungry by noontime and very hungry by 5 p.m. and just needing to eat. Um, and now I basically don't even really think about food. I get up in the morning, I might not eat until 10 or 11. And lots of times I eat just because, oh, it's probably time I should eat something. So my whole, I wouldn't say appetite, my actual need for calories is much less than it was before.
approximately how much do you need actual currently?
I'm thinking it's somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 calories is what I'm eating
Okay,
on a daily basis. Yeah.
okay, okay, perfect.
But I'm also getting older, so maybe it's just a factor of being older. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it's related to my vitamin A diet, though.
Yes. Okay. Um, today, well, it's maybe a funny question, but what is the percentage of sureness, of certitude about the toxicity of vitamin A?
100%,
100%, not a single percent. Okay.
not zero doubt.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because one thing that I appreciate in your book was, I think it was the first book you start like this. You said, don't take my word for granted. Everything in this book could be false. And I
Yeah.
found that was a very honorable way to start a book because, like you said, everybody should every time question what we are told because we have
Mhm.
full responsibility of our health.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think, yeah, people need to be very careful, especially, let's just use the Weston Price, recommendations, which is, so flawed, it's so wrong, and are going to cause so much damage. You need to be very careful and, look at the evidence. Don't look at what people say or claim. Look at the evidence. Yeah.
Okay. But the evidence is sometimes not so evident. So,
It's not so clear. Yeah. And, yeah, there's a lot of shenanigans going on in medical research. Yeah, for sure.
okay. So maybe my last question could be about the evidence because in your book you bring a lot of different studies, and we have a part on the scientific, what we can call it, fraud, and
Yep.
you give the details in your book how the studies
Yeah,
are peer-reviewed and the problems with that. Can you
right.
maybe give us an introduction to this kind of problem?
Yeah, well, when I started reading, the medical research in my investigation with vitamin A, one thing that really jumped off the page at me was the scientific fraud going on. I come up from a background of engineering and pure science, and you just can't do this kind of fraud in engineering because nature will catch you, right? It's like you can't manipulate something and use debate and peer pressure to push some agenda because imagine you're going to design a new type of steel, and you make this claim that it's like 3x stronger than other types of steel. Well, you might be able to kind of fake that until you get it on the market, but once you put it into service, nature is going to cause the structure to collapse. So you cannot do that in engineering science. So that's why I was very surprised to see the amount of fraud in medical science, and it's ubiquitous. It is so glaringly common. Now, there's a lot of legitimate medical science and legitimate studies, but there's so many that are manipulated, and you can just tell that it's being manipulated for profit reasons. And so one of the studies that I documented in my ebook was the national toxicity study done on the cancer-causing aspects of vitamin A palmitate, and just go through, the fraud in that paper. It's so simple and so easy to spot. It's for sure fraud, and very serious fraud. Like, we're talking about the cause of skin cancer in a lot of children. And, they go through all these shenanigans and ways to obfuscate it and cover it up and bury it. And so this is what I was saying before. There's something going on in medical research where you really are not allowed to say something negative about vitamin A. And that's a very good example in that paper. And there's been other examples. The Will Walk Hall study, I think, was kind of half fraud, half watch science. But so that's another example. And just with immense negative consequences to human health. So those are a few. I've seen a lot more. I could write a book about the fraud.
Yes.
And actually, there's a good book. There's a good book published recently by Cheryl Atkinson talking about the endemic and systematic fraud in the medical sector. So very good book for someone to read. Anyway.
Yes, you wrote it in the book. Fortunately, these people don't build airplanes because the airplane
Yeah.
would immediately crash. But
Yeah.
with health, you can do this kind of stuff because
Yeah.
the health is not collapsing immediately. It's
Yeah.
a
And you
slow
can
poisoning. Yes.
yeah, and you can always blame it on something else, right? It's you can say, well, the patient, had these other factors. There's just so many excuses in ways to cover it up. So yeah. Mhm.
Okay. So my last question is, do you have another subject than vitamin A? Do you maybe discover in your research another so-called nutrient that is not one? Do you have ideas, or the topic
Well,
is closed?
I have a very good blog post on niacin. It's probably not really of much interest to people in France because they don't believe wheat is. Oh, I'm sure it's not supplemented with niacin, but we have niacin here in Canada, which is claimed to be an essential vitamin. But I've got a long blog post about that. And I have a similar concern with vitamin D. So vitamin D is widely touted as being so beneficial and essential. Well, vitamin D actually blunts the toxicity of vitamin A. So vitamin D and vitamin A bond to the same cellular receptor. So if you're suffering from vitamin A toxicity, you take some vitamin D, you might feel better for a while because vitamin D is actually blunting that uptake of vitamin A. So yes, there's this perceived benefit of vitamin D, but I think in the long term, vitamin D is also toxic. Not as toxic as vitamin A, but still something to be aware of. I have a really good blog post on vitamin C, on the causation of scurvy, which I think is another flawed piece of science. And there's some other things that I've become interested in actually outside of the health space, but so yeah.
Okay. When you talk about vitamin D, do you talk about the supplement or you talk about the vitamin D created with the sun exposure to the sunlight?
No, just the supplement.
Okay.
So yeah, and there's a long discussion there. We won't have time for it now, but yeah. So I think people getting sunlight is super beneficial, and actually, sunlight will actually break down some of the vitamin A that's in your skin, and you have to be careful about getting too much sunlight. But sunlight is very beneficial for people's health. Yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah,
So the sunlight is breaking the retinoic acid or the
it
bound
does.
retinol, which
Well, it breaks down the retinoids, probably more retinol. And there's a link to a paper that talks about the photo decomposition of vitamin A in my ebook. So people can look at that or maybe just Google for that study. So yeah, sunlight definitely breaks down vitamin A.
and do you
But
think a sunburn is simply toxicity that is burned, or it's more complex than
no,
that?
it's more complex because when sunlight breaks down vitamin A, it actually unfortunately breaks it down into even more toxic molecules temporarily. So a sunburn, like, um, is I think very much related to the vitamin A content of the skin or the carotenoid content of the skin. Or if the carotenoid content or the vitamin A content of your skin is higher, you're far more susceptible to um, uh, sun exposure causing you a problem or causing a sunburn. So there's a definite connection between a sunburn and vitamin A and the carotenoids. So you need to be careful, but just like anything else, just go slow.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, Grant. I don't have another question. Maybe if you want to talk about a last subject, I give you the possibility, or we can stop here.
No, I think well, what I'll ask is, thank you for doing this interview and bringing more exposure to this topic. And so my whole mission was to get more and more people participating in this. We've got a lot of people participating in it, lots of people in North America, quite a few people from Europe also. And kind of slowly over time, we're getting more and more testimonials about people recovering their health. It's not an easy path. Like there's lots of setbacks and things that can go wrong here, but it's very important that we come to a real determination about, is vitamin A a vitamin or is it not a vitamin? And if it's not a vitamin, therefore it's only a toxin. And then we could, eventually, hopefully have these organizations like the World Health Organization stop supplementing children with it all around the world because it's just doing nothing but harming their health. So this is both a important topic for people that want to recover their own health, but there's a much bigger mission here to get a better understanding of what's causing chronic disease in the first place. And so I think that's, just my appeal to people to, participate in this and share their stories and, share the message. And lastly, I'm a big advocate of sharing both positive stories and negative stories. You'll see people that have, you know, um, selling products or whatever, selling services, and they're always talking about just the successes. But I also want to talk about where we don't have successes and where people are having problems, because by doing that, we can get a better understanding how to mitigate those problems. So once again, just an appeal for people to, take this seriously, really think about it, hopefully apply it. And, if it works for you and you get a good health outcome, and, share the message and, get involved. I guess my position is, it's not a spectator sport. It's not like watching a sporting event, like, get involved and participate.
Yes, I can now remember in your preface or your introduction, you wrote, it's not important if we agree with you or not. It's important that we participate so we can decide whether one way or not, whether it's right or not, if I rightly
Right.
remember. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So thank you, Grant, for your time and your investigation, and I hope we can do that again maybe in the future.
Sounds very good. All right. Thank you, Jeremy. See you.
Thank you. Bye.